Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. As always, I'd like to start by acknowledging and thanking the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast and you never miss an episode, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a members-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the perks. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled that joining me on the podcast to talk about her novel, The King's Mother, is Annie Garthwaite. Annie grew up in a working-class community in the northeast of England. She studied English at the University of Wales before embarking on a 30-year international business career. In 2017, she studied for an MA in creative writing at Warwick University, and during 2 years of study wrote her debut novel, Cecily, which was published by Penguin in 2021. Cecily was named a top pick by The Times and Sunday Times, a best book of 2021 by independent bookshops and Waterstones, and has recently been optioned for TV. Annie's second novel, The King's Mother, will be published by Penguin on the 11th of July, 2024. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome to Talking Tudors, Annie. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. I've been looking forward to our conversation. So why don't we begin with an introduction, and maybe you can just tell us all a little bit about you and your background.
Yeah, well, I'm Annie, and my second novel, The King's Mother, is being published shortly on the 11th of July. And it's the second book that I've written about the Wars of the Roses, and specifically about the women of the Wars of the Roses. And that has been a fascination of mine since my teenage years, So these books and the ideas for these books and the characters in these books have been living in my head for 40 plus years. And finally, they're making it onto the page. So that's really exciting for me. And I'd always promised myself that when I was age 55, I would give up the day job and I would write this story. And now the second book is coming out, and it's the culmination of all of that. And it feels like a real life milestone.
What a wonderful story. And was there anything specific that actually inspired your interest in this period of history?
Well, it all began, as I suppose it often does for people, it kind of began in school. I mean, before that, a little bit, I had a mother who was an avid reader of historical fiction, usually quite romantic historical fiction, but I read a lot of those with her, as you do. But then when I was in school, sometimes you're lucky enough to have an inspirational teacher. And it wasn't a particularly great school. It was a very ordinary comprehensive school in the northeast of England, but not very academic or high achieving at all. But I had a history teacher who was just passionate. He was just passionate about his subject. And I guess at a time when most history teachers were just force feeding facts and dates into kids' heads, he was just asking them much more interesting questions about motivation and cause. And why do you think he did that? And what do you think she thought when he did that? And he just spoke about these great characters of the Wars of the Roses as if they were about to walk in the door, not as if it was 500 plus years ago. And I was just completely captivated. And it was such a gift to give me, really, because that's been a lifelong pleasure. And teachers have enormous power, don't they?
Oh,
Even
they
for good
sure
or ill.
do. They sure do. And I've heard that several times, that teachers have inspired people's love. And isn't that wonderful that, that you can be that inspirational person for someone? I think it's so, so important. Now, Annie, before...
Really isn't. Oh, sorry. I'll tell you this little story because it's just so wonderful. After Cecily came out, I was in a little bookshop in the northeast of England again. And I'd just gone in to sign some books. So I was just sitting in the back of the shop, quietly signing away. And a woman came up to me, a customer, and she said, "Oh, Cecily, is this your book?" I said, "Yes, it's my book." And she said, "Oh, I've read it, and my husband's read it." And her husband came over, and she said, "We really loved it." And he then started to tell me that he was himself a history teacher, and he'd been teaching the Wars of the Roses to his O-level group. It's not O-level anymore, is it? But you know what I mean. And he said, couldn't get the girls interested in the Wars of the Roses at all. He said the boys were fine. There was lots of fighting and swords, and they loved all of that. But the girls, I couldn't get them interested. So he said, I went away and I bought them each a copy of Cecily, and they read it. And he said, now I can't get them to talk about anything but the Wars of the Roses.
What a wonderful story.
Well, it is, isn't it? And it made me feel quite tearful because I thought, gosh, all those years ago, there was my history teacher inspiring me. And I remember him giving me novels to read as well as textbooks all those years ago, and from that was the germ of the idea to write this story so many years later. And now there's another history teacher using my novel to get young women excited about history.
Oh, I love that. And I love that you focus obviously on the perspective of the women. And we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. But I did want to ask you a little bit about the historical context of your novel, if you could maybe tell us what's happening in England at the time. And I know that you mentioned that you might do a short reading for us. So perhaps we can do one of that.
Will. Yes, I will. Well, the novel opens in 1461. So we're right on the cusp of regime change. Edward IV, who is the son of one of our main characters, Cecily Neville, is about to take the throne. It then looks ahead 30 years that the novel covers a span of, nearly 30 years, up until 1485 with the Battle of Bosworth, but of course regime change again when your lot, the Tudors, come in. So it's a period of years in which England is, for a large part of that time, in a state of chaos and political confusion, constant regime change, and almost incessant civil war and factional fighting. So it's a very dramatic period. And when the story of these years is usually told, the focus is on the big beasts of the 15th century. Edward IV, Warwick the Kingmaker, Henry the Sound, the blokes, basically. But I think far more interesting is what the women are up to. So this book takes 4 female characters, Cecily Neville, Margaret of Anjou, Margaret Beaufort, and Elizabeth Woodville, and looks at what they were doing. And they were not just passive victims of the war. They were not silent observers. They were active, politically active, driving forces. And, they were often the drivers of conflict and war. Too, how historians' opinions about what happened in this period differ so much. So much is contentious. So much is argued over still. And so much of it is difficult to fathom. You look at some of the things that happen and you think, how on earth did we get to that point? What I always say is, if you look at what the women were doing and what their motivations were, the actions of the men make a lot more sense. And I just feel very strongly that the women have been ignored. I was at a history conference a few months ago, and there was a chap there, a historian, a very revered historian of this period, and I won't name him because that wouldn't be fair. But I was interested to know what his thoughts were about Margaret Beaufort. So I asked him, and he looked at me as if I'd just fallen out of the sky and said, I've never given the woman a moment's thought.
Goodness. That's shocking.
Don't you think you should? She's mother of the Tudor dynasty. Don't you think you should pay her some attention? So I guess that's been one of my missions all through this, for wanting to write this book, is to put the women back in the story and realize their importance, because they were right in the thick of it. You know, when Margaret of Anjou was struggling to win back her throne from Edward IV, it wasn't her husband, Henry VI, who was leading the army. It was her. And, you know, Henry VII, yes, he beat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, but he wouldn't have even made it to the battlefield if it weren't for his mother and her maneuverings and her machinations behind the scenes. You know, so we've been sold a bit of a pup, really, I guess, by Hollywood and by more romantic historical fiction and by male historians, to believe that medieval aristocratic women were largely passive and politically disengaged, and they weren't. So I kind of wanted to tell this story. And so I thought I would read you a little bit. It's right from the beginning of the novel, and I wanted to get across, I guess, the feeling of tension and drama that propels this story forward, but also to position one of the key themes that this book is about, because this is a book about mothers and sons and about what what mothers are prepared to do for their children. And I thought that's this little bit at the beginning of the novel sets that out fairly well. So it's Easter Sunday. It's the 4th of April in 1461, and we're in Westminster. Tenebrae, vigil for the crucified Christ. And in the darkness before dawn, a single candle is passed hand to hand. Cecily is cold. She has not slept, nor broken her fast since the Passion began. But when the flame comes at last to her, she wraps a hand about it and arcs her face to its bright heat. She curls her fingers close, then closer still, till they begin to burn and her eyes to smart. She won't shrink from it. Instead, she lowers her lids, lets the light play upon them, and smiles tight against the pain. This is God's promise, she tells herself. Edward, her son, still lives, so far away, yet still her flesh feels the fire in him. It's 3 weeks since he rode to war against Lancaster, a king proclaimed but not yet crowned. Let me earn it first, he told the cheering crowd. The usurper Henry still lives, his bitch queen Marguerite and her bastard son. When I've put them down, then I'll take up my kingdom. They cheered him all the more for that, just as Cecily said they would when she told him to say it. She stood beside him, relishing the weight of his army at her back, the bladed ranks of archers, pikemen, and foot, the lumbering artillery with its pent-up violence of powder and shot. His men called out for him as he mounted, then quieted at their captain's barking, till there was only the impatient creak of harness, the chink and shear of steel, and high above her head, the snapping of royal pennants, the lions of England rampant, and his own devices, bright and new, the sun in splendour, the white gilded rose. She watched him stand in the saddle for one last look behind, a brisk nod to his captains, then a settling, a shift in his focus, a widening of the space between them before even a step was taken. She laid her hand on his horse's shoulder and felt the slide of muscle over bone. He checked it, reined in, and leaned down so only she would see his grin. Keep my kingdom, Captain Mother, till I come back for it. Then he grasped her hand and kissed it, his mouth against her fingers, warm as a bed. And what's interesting about that, I think, is that when, Edward, as you've probably guessed, is going off, he's racing north to go and fight Marguerite at the Battle of Towton. And when he went, and he had accepted the kingship, he had not been crowned, so right in the middle of regime change, and he left his kingdom in his mother's charge. He named her as head of his household, which is effectively his regent while he was off fighting. So, and it makes sense when you think about it. He's 18 years old, a very young man, great with the sword, built like a warrior, very good at fighting, but, a boy. And Cecily was already a seasoned political player of 30 years standing, so who else would he implicitly trust to keep his kingdom secure while he was off fighting? But his mother. Powerless medieval women, eh? I don't think so.
Oh, thank you for reading us that passage. That was wonderful. I wanted to keep listening, actually. So you've introduced the women. You've told us who the 4 women are, but can you tell us just a little bit about each of them?
So we have Cecily, and she is famously the matriarch of the House of York. And as the novel opens, her husband and the second of her sons, Edmund, have just been killed at the Battle of Wakefield in the wars. So at the point when the novel opens, she is a woman in a state of grief and a woman in some trouble and at a point of very high risk. And it's no spoiler to say that Edward wins at Towton and becomes King Edward IV. And she becomes the king's mother, arguably the most powerful woman in the kingdom. But she has gone through struggle and hardship in order to get to that point. So she is Cecily, the king's mother. Then we have Marguerite, the deposed queen. Marguerite is Henry VI's French wife and queen. And Henry VI, as you probably know, was effectively deposed by Edward and by the Yorkist faction. He was a very troubled king, suffered from probably catatonic schizophrenia is what we guess now, but that meant that he experienced years of, long periods of mental illness and incapacity, really. Bit of a disaster as a king. And Marguerite has one young son whose cause she is fighting for. So as the novel opens, Marguerite is down, but she is definitely not out. She is still fighting very hard. The third lady is Elizabeth Woodville, who famously becomes Edward IV's queen. And she, through the course of the novel, I think they've been married. Edward's been on the throne for years or so when he and Elizabeth marry. And she kind of then takes that first lady position from Cecily as queen consort to Edward. And she was an unexpected marriage for Edward. She was still aristocracy, but she was definitely a rung down. And she was a Lancastrian widow with 2 children already, famously. And they married in secret. So there's a whole lot of drama and intrigue going on there. But then there's a huge question eventually about the legitimacy of Edward and Elizabeth's marriage, which I won't go into too much because of spoilers. But she ends up too having to fight and struggle for her son's inheritance, her royal son's inheritance. And then, of course, we have Margaret Beaufort, with whom you will be incredibly familiar, mother of Henry VII. And she, as the novel opens, is a very young woman, half Cecily's age. And one of the things that I really loved about writing this story, and Henry at the point when the novel opens is a very small child. But one of the things that I really felt writing this story was that my admiration for Margaret grew and grew and grew. Yeah, she's an extraordinary woman. She's so determined. She's so smart. She's so brave. She never gives in. And she and Cecily, they're so alike. You can't put a bus ticket between them. They're so alike. And what I became very conscious of was what good friends they were, that they had a very close and intimate relationship. I think Cecily became a sort of older woman role model for Margaret, and I think she modeled her behavior on Cecily's. And certainly when Margaret becomes king's mother herself, the similarities between the way she conducts herself in that role and the way Cecily conducted herself in that role are striking. So she's amazing.
Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about those qualities or traits that you found that the women had in common.
Well, they are all women from the 15th century social elite. They are part of a very small sort of social structure, social substrate, if you like. See, that's another thing that I think historians often overlook. You would get the idea often reading the history that these women didn't really know each other and were unconnected to one another. But in fact, they were intimates. They all knew each other very, very well. They were part of each other's lives and social circle. The other thing that they all had in common was they were all mothers. And, I say all the time that this is a book about maternal ferocity. and female ambition. And the big question the book begs is, what is a mother prepared to do for her child? You know, if your overall aim is to put your child in a place of safety, and for these particular women, the only place of safety was on the throne of England for their boys. It was the only place they would be safe. What lengths will you go to secure that? And what sacrifices will you make along the way? And who will you sacrifice along the way? So that's kind of the dilemma that faces small. And I often say to people, you know, there are people who will read this book because they love this period of history. You know, they're either Was of the Roses fans, or they're Yorkist or Lancaster fans, or they're Tudor fans, or whatever. But there are some people who will read it who really don't know the history and could care less about the history. And to them, I always say, you know, the question of the book is a timeless one. Forget the history. It's about women and mothers particularly. And I found that absolutely fascinating.
Yes, it's such an intriguing question.
In one way or another, they're all driven to do some quite dreadful things, you know.
Yeah, such an intriguing question. I know I'm the mother of a gorgeous, handsome son. So you've got me thinking about, if I was in that position, what would I do? So fascinating. Such an interesting question. Yeah. So what about the challenges? Obviously, these women face challenges. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yes, I think the sad thing about all of these women is that they are very alike. They are all intelligent, smart, determined, with a potential for ruthlessness. They all, at some level, like and respect one another, but circumstances drive them into adversity with one another, relentlessly drive them into adversity. And that, of course, is a terrible challenge for all of them. They all end up having to fight. So I think there's certainly that. And, you know, the Wars of the Roses is in the end a huge family row. You know, is it York against Lancaster, or is it the Nevilles against the Beauforts, or is it the Earl of Warwick against everybody? Where does it begin? And it's just intriguing to me to see how these women operate within the challenges and constraints placed upon them by their male relatives, by the violent aggression of their male relatives, and by the jealousy and envy of their male relatives.
Now, you did, of course, already touch on the fact that they go to great lengths to promote their family interests, but do you want to maybe tell us a few of the ways in which they do that? How do you promote your family's interests in the 15th century as a woman?
I'm being very cautious not to give away too many
spoilers. Yes, of course.
I mean, people often say, you know, can you have a spoiler if it's history from 500 years ago? And you kind of can. You kind of can in this period, because the way people approach the history is so different and so varied. Well, certainly for aristocratic women, one of the things that they were expected to do, it was kind of accepted within their role, was to manage that complex set of familial relationships that would keep their family afloat and buoyant and successful. So that often meant arranging marriages or inheritances for their children. It often meant being involved in maintaining those social friendships and connections. The whole business, you know, about how young boys were routinely sent out into other households to serve a kind of apprenticeship. And often that would be arranged and organized by the women. And it was a way of keeping all of those social connections, but in this very elite social set, sort of alive, really, I suppose. You know, when Edward becomes king, he's a young 18-year-old gorgeous bachelor, and his hand in marriage is something of a political trophy, I guess. And certainly when he goes and secretly marries a Lancastrian widow with no money and 2 kids, it's not the marriage that Cecily was intending him for. Intending for him. She'd envisaged perhaps a French match that would bring at least an alliance, if not a large dowry, into his treasury, which frankly needed the cash injection. So that's a great example of a way that women's ambitions for managing their family were subverted by the, shall we say, less emotionally mature behavior of their men.
It's an excellent example. Thank you so much. And you mentioned earlier that your admiration respect for Margaret Beaufort grew as you researched and wrote your novel. Did your opinion about any of the other women change during the course of your research, or any of the characters that are in your book?
Yeah, I got increasingly cross with Warwick the Kingmaker. That's I think most people wind up being cross with Warwick
Yeah,
the
I
Kingmaker.
think so.
I mean, my respect for Margaret, particularly, I will talk about that a little bit because, life deals her such a terrible hand. She is married and pregnant at the age of 12, which even in those days was considered unacceptable, shall we say. Had Henry at 13, never managed to have another child again. Whether she was physically or emotionally damaged by the experience, we don't know, I guess, do we really? But certainly it wasn't an experience she was about to repeat. And I love that relationship that she has with Henry. She describes him as her only desired joy in all the world, which is just so wonderful. And yet they're separated for so long. He's in exile for all of his youth, and she is separated from him. And she never ever gives up trying to find a way to bring him home. And I'm not in the camp that believes that Margaret was always had her eye on the throne for him. I think that was a very, very late development. I think she would have been very happy to bring him home as Earl of Richmond and sort of within the Yorkist rule. But then she saw her opportunity and was forced by circumstances to take it. And that's the kind of turning point of her career, really, and the moral turning point of her career. The other woman I really grew to understand better, I think, is Elizabeth Woodville. And there are things about Elizabeth that I just find vastly irritating. But she had a hard time, and she did her level best to live up to the expectations of queenship, which she was not prepared for. She was not brought up with the expectation of a royal marriage. And that must have been difficult to acclimatize yourself to. And there's no question in my mind that she suffered because of Cecily's family's opposition to her. Not Cecily's opposition. I don't think Cecily was opposed to her particularly, but Cecily's family were opposed to her. And she unquestionably suffered, and suffered at the hands of her husband too, I think. So my sympathies for Elizabeth really grew.
It's amazing what they went through, and oh goodness, the losses, the suffering. It's so hard to even kind of try and put yourself into that mindset, isn't it? Losing all those children. They all knew that loss, didn't they? It's heartbreaking, yes, really. Absolutely heartbreaking. So in general, what has your research taught you about medieval women? And you've already touched on this a little bit, but maybe we can sum it up, and the power that they could wield.
Yeah, I think that the rot set in with Shakespeare, I think. I love him, but he wasn't great to women. And the female characters in the Wars of the Roses, Shakespeare's Wars of the Roses cycle, do not get a fair crack of the whip. And Cecily in particular. Cecily, when she appears in those plays, is old, pious, dull. She has no power. She has no agency. She wanders around complaining a lot about how awful her kids are, and it's not her fault. And it doesn't matter because no one's listening to her anyway. And Margaret Beaufort, all she can do is curse. And I think that idea of these women as impotent to effect change stems from that and has continued. And I really do call for a revision of our view of women in the Middle Ages. They were immensely influential and powerful. And I'm not saying it was a perfect state. I'm not saying that it wasn't a deeply misogynistic and chauvinistic society. Of course it was. We couldn't have a regnant queen, for example, though Cecily or Margaret would have been a very good one. But they were not sitting around all day doing their embroidery and listening to the lute. They were serious players in politics and business and world affairs, and they knew what they were about. Yeah. And when Edward had his kingdom in Cecily's charge, he knew what he was doing.
Just to start wrapping up our conversation, you've obviously talked about the fact that you believe it's very important for the story of the Wars of the Roses to be told from the point of view of women. Why do you think there's been a barrier to that up until this point? I know that it's certainly becoming more popular now, which is wonderful. Do you think that the paucity of sources perhaps has anything to do with that at all?
No, I think it's pure and simple male bias. I think it's the assumption that the guys who wield the swords have all the power. And I think that's a very naive assumption. And nor do I think it's a new thing, and nor do I think it's limited to the Wars of the Roses period either. I think there's been a consistent attempt to whitewash women out of history. This idea that before the 21st century, women didn't do anything is just complete nonsense.
Yeah, and these are centuries that produce some pretty impressive women, I have to say, the 15th and 16th centuries. I'm sure there are others, but this is where obviously my work is focused, and I'm always amazed by the strong, courageous, intelligent, witty, and I could go on, women that these centuries produce. So thank you for shining a light on these 4 amazing women who are just so fascinating. But I can't let you go yet, Annie, because there's something we do at the end of episodes of Talking Tudors, and that's what I like to call a little game of 10 to go. So just 10 quick questions to get to know you a little bit better. So the first one is, can you tell us about a historic site associated with the Wars of the Roses that you find inspiring?
Yes, I can. Yes. Well, there are lots, but on my list, I'm going to put pretty high the Richard III Visitor Centre in Leicester, which is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. It's 10 years.
Wow, 10 years already. Goodness.
I know, it's incredible, isn't it? But I would urge people to go there because whichever side you're on in the Wars of the Roses, that's where it ended. And that's where the Tudor dynasty began. And I think it's good to go there and just sit and contemplate that, because you have the end of civil war in England. Civil war sort of torn the country apart for many years. You have the birth of the Tudor dynasty, and it's at that point. And that body was found there and now lies there forever. And I think that it's a great place to go and reflect on that. And I think the centre does a very good job of obviously it's the Richard III Visitor Centre, but I think it does a very good job at representing both sides of that conflict.
And what about a book that you're currently reading, or the last book that you read?
Oh, well, I'll tell you a great one. And it is historical fiction, actually, that I've just finished, but in a very, very, very different time period. It's set in ancient Syracuse, and it's called Glorious Exploits by a chap called Ferdia Lennon. It's one of the funniest books I've ever read, but one of the darkest books I've ever read. It's you sort of laugh and then feel bad for laughing quite often. The premise is that there was the Athenians invaded Syracuse and they lost, and the Syracusans imprisoned all of these Athenian prisoners in an old disused quarry where they quietly set about the business of dying of heat exhaustion and starvation. And we have these 2 characters, 2 Syracusan lads, bit of a lad types, who are in love with the theatre of Euripides, and they convince themselves that they're going to go and get these poor Athenian prisoners to perform Euripides plays in exchange for food. And it's just I'm telling you this and thinking that sounds like a ridiculous premise for a novel, but trust me, it's utterly, utterly wonderful, and it's not like anything else I've read in a long time. It's a real winner.
And what about a new skill or a new hobby that you might like to learn?
Oh, a new skill I'd like to learn. Well, do you know what I've been thinking about recently? I'd quite like to learn to do good Gothic copperplate calligraphy. I think that would be a nice thing to do. Better than my scruffy handwriting anyway. That would be good.
That sounds really good. And what about the last film or series perhaps that you've watched? It doesn't have to be a historical one.
Well, the last thing I saw on screen was one of these live broadcasts that they do from the theatre, and you can go and see them at your cinema. And I went to see Martin Sheen in Nye, where he plays Nye Bevan, who famously founded the National Health Service. Yeah, I'd really recommend that as an insight to that, the creation of the National Health, but also the nature of the class struggle in England, in the UK as well. It's a fascinating insight to that.
Annie, when you were a child, what did you want to be when you were older? What did you want to be when you were all grown up?
I always wanted to write. Yeah, I did. And I mean, quite literally, the idea for these 2 novels, Cecily and the King's Mother, were born in my head when I was in my very early teens. When I was in school with that history teacher, Keith Hill, there was this idea that that would be what I would one day do.
Wow, how wonderful that you've done that. That's amazing.
I know. Pinch me. It's actually happening.
And obviously you're a huge fan of the medieval period, this period of the Wars of the Roses. Are there any other periods of history that really capture your attention?
Yeah, I have become a complete addict of Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, which is really
It's amazing.
me deep into the Tudor period, because I'll be honest, to me, the Tudors are always a bit the baddies, right? But that has opened up that world to me so much. Yeah, so I'm perhaps moving into that. But my next novel actually is going to be a move back in time a little bit to Edward II and his wife, his queen Isabella, who I don't know if you know the story, but if she was French girl brought over to marry him and become Queen of England. He was a bit of a disaster as a king, and she deposed him. I thought, well, there's got to be a story there.
There has to be a story.
The French queen who puts down an English king. Yeah.
I like it. I like it. What about an ideal Sunday morning? What does that consist of?
Oh, a big walk. Yeah. I live in rural Shropshire, not far from the Welsh borders. So my ideal Sunday morning would be to take myself off into the hills on the borders and walk the borders.
Oh, it's so beautiful around there. So atmospheric, I find as well. So very inspirational for all your writing. And lucky last question, who is a person who you admire and who you find inspiring? Again, this doesn't have to be someone from history. It could be a contemporary person.
Well, Cecily ranks pretty high.
Yeah.
She really does. And I would have to put Margaret Beaufort right there alongside her too. I admire them both. But I'll also mention, and I've mentioned her name already, I really admire Hilary Mantel because she's just such a fabulous writer. She's just such a fabulous writer and such a fabulous historian, but her real gift is in her understanding of human nature and human motivation. And I find that stunning. Have you ever listened to her Reith lectures?
No, somebody mentioned them in one of the last episodes, actually, and I've been meaning to. It's definitely on my list.
Give yourself a treat.
Yeah.
Listen to them.
Yeah, I'm going
because
to.
They are full of wisdom, and wisdom about writing, absolutely, but also just wisdom about understanding human history as it is affected by the vagaries of human nature. It's just she's a complete marvel, I think, and much missed.
Yeah. Oh goodness, what a loss! Absolutely, but yes, that's it. That's a sign from the universe. I need to listen to those lectures because that's the second person that's you've mentioned them. So that's
you
great.
do listen to them and tell me what you think.
I will, absolutely. I love going for long walks as well, so I like to pop the headphones on and off I go. So that'll be good company. And the very last thing, Annie, sorry, I said that was the last question, but there is one more, and that's for a takeaway. I ask all my guests, normally it's a Tudor takeaway, but in this case, we can certainly have a medieval or a 15th century takeaway. So something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode. Sometimes people suggest books to read, songs to listen to, films to watch. Do you have a takeaway for us?
Yeah, I do. It's another novel, and it's the novel that started my infatuation with this whole period of history. And again, it goes right back to my history teacher, because when he realized that I was interested in what he was teaching us, which was unusual because I think most of his other students were either asleep or nicking off, but he realized I was alive and interested. He just kept lobbing books over, read that, he'd say, and another book would come flying onto my desk. And usually it was a textbook or a biography or, something like that. But just occasionally a novel. And the one that came flying over the desk that really impressed me most was a novel called We Speak No Treason by Rosemary Hawley Jarman. And I think it was first published in 1971. And I remember looking at the cover, which had sort of damsels dancing and knights in armor on it. And I thought, oh, this looks like romance. And he said, no, just read it. And I did, and I fell in love with the characters, and it is beautifully written. It is slightly romantic, but it's beautiful at sentence level. She's a fabulous writer. It's just lovely. And I fell in love with the characters, and I fell in love with that gift of being able to put words on pages in an order that makes people feel deep emotion, So it led me into a love of history, and it led me into a love of words on the page. So yes, Rosemary Hawley Jarman, We Speak No Treason. Shamelessly pro-Yorkist, shamelessly romantic, but a really great read.
Oh, it sounds wonderful. And I have to say, in several, almost several hundred episodes, no one's ever mentioned it. So thank you for that original takeaway, Annie. And thank you so much for taking the time to come onto the podcast and talk to us about your amazing book and the inspiration behind it. I'm sure we're all going to run out the door now and purchase it immediately, because just that little reading was absolutely wonderful. So thank you so much.
Well, it's coming along on the 11th of July. Pop along to your favorite independent bookshop and buy it there. They need your help.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been lovely to talk to you.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.